Our next speaker is going to look at this from an economic perspective. So our next speaker is Thomas Prusa from Rutgers University.
Thank you. So I'll try and go fairly quickly so we have time for Q&A, because there's actually probably a lot of interesting questions that we can all learn from. Let me say that the issue of kind of renegotiating preferential trade agreements or exiting from them, it's a really complicated issue. 15 minutes is obviously really not enough to go in depth. And part of the reason is it's really not clear at all sitting here today on February 3rd what we're really talking about. Are we going to pull out of existing preferential trade agreements? And then the question would be, what's next? In my own view, what we've seen in the past, that renegotiation is really hard and lengthy. Now, maybe in fact, strong-arming Japan might very quickly concede and just do TPP over again, just bilateral with the United States. But that's not obvious. If you exit from NAFTA, how long will we go without a North American preferential trade agreement? Now, we might just go back to MFN, and in all honesty, that's really not bad. There are a lot of economists, in fact, really mourn the emergence of all these preferential trade agreements and really would be happy to return to the WTO as the center of the trade universe. On the other hand, there's no guarantee we're going to be in the WTO in 4 years. And I want to talk about, coming up, is the challenge of negotiating country by country instead of multilateral. On one hand, it seems simple because it's darn hard to get 11 other countries to agree. It's also really hard to simultaneously or sequentially negotiate with a bunch of other countries. So the time frame for all this is also highly uncertain. So really, basically, this is a really speculative talk. So one question would be I want to take a minute and remind everybody, how do you think about trade? Okay, on the left side of the screen, I think I'm quite sure that the president thinks it is a zero-sum game. And it's quite sad in a way that we're having this discussion still, that the size of the pie that you take away and give to Mexico or is given to Canada or whoever we're negotiating with is a one-for-one reduction in how much pie you have. That's really hard to take. It really makes me feel humble that for 30 years I've been teaching students that on the right side of the screen we have David Ricardo and the idea of trade and liberalization trade isn't just slicing pie and dividing how much you get, but in fact the pie grows. That is humbling that, in fact, we apparently haven't pushed very far. Now, I do want to say that makes me feel not so depressed is Doug Irwin has a fabulous book, especially for students who are here today. Let me say he's a fantastic writer, and this is a great history. The idea that I'm mourning that my 30-year college career apparently has had no impact, that people still think trade is a zero-sum game. Doug does a great job in this book basically saying this is our history, that this argument that we're having is been repeated and repeated, apparently in all known history. Great book, highly recommended. Let me talk a couple minutes now about the question about decision to leave preferential trade agreements. So let's really specifically now, maybe I would say in my own view, two super high target preferential trade agreements would be NAFTA, obviously, but also Korea, U.S. Korea would be a thorn, I would assume, in someone's side in the administration. They run really large bilateral trade surpluses with the United States. Now, I have here, I think this is the world that at 1600 Pennsylvania, we're really giant, we're really big, and then everybody else is really small, and we should be able to take advantage of that. So this is really the good side. On the other hand, I think this is in fact what they think at USTR right now, which is all these small guys are a pain in the side, and they're tying us down. And I really want to do one-on-one deals, right? Because their ability to gang up on us is really binding and restrictive to us. Now, the problem is so there's hundreds of preferential trade agreements in the world, hundreds. And they vary the gamut from being apparently, you look at some of these and they're really just very short political documents, and maybe it's really helpful that two African nations sign these agreements and there's not much content. Maybe they won't have a war anymore. The ones that we sign are really complicated animals. And this is just a list of some of the issues that would be included in a typical modern preferential trading agreement, and this is not to be exhaustive. I've highlighted in blue on the screen what I would say are the high ones of what really matter. Notice I haven't highlighted tariff preferences. But investment rules, regulations, and standards, rules of origin are somehow often lost on the importance of getting rules of origins correct or how you've defined them. Intellectual property, I mean, this is, for the United States, this is a significant deal. There's all these things in there, yet I think we've referred to Youngstown, Ohio a bunch of times, in the beleaguered parts of the United States that have struggled in the last 30, 40, or 50 years, really, of how they feel that their economic might has been eroded. I think in a lot of ways they think about the tariff preference side. I doubt that they're really thinking hard about intellectual property and whether that protects Johnson & Johnson in Mexico. I think they're really thinking about they've given up tariff preferences. And by the way, tariff preferences, this is, again, a mixed thing that many trade economists are unhappy with preferential trade agreements because there's both trade creation and trade diversion, and it's kind of a mixed bag, and it's ambiguous what might happen with this. Now, on tariff utilization in these preferential trade agreements, I mean, there's now emerging as a fairly long literature on this that it's fairly costly to use preferential rates. If I had to give you what I would say is kind of the mean sense of use of preferential trade agreement, I'd say 50%. In the case of NAFTA, about 56% of the imports from Mexico use NAFTA rates. So, I mean, it's 44% are just coming under MFN rates. And the reason for that is that a lot of our bound rates are zero or near zero, and complying to get the NAFTA rates is costly for firms. It's estimated to be about 2 to 6% equivalent tariff just to comply. So there's a set of products that have really high tariffs that'll be worthwhile to comply. But for a lot of products, you'd rather just come in on the MFN rate. And I here on the slide, I document this is a common thing you see across preferential trade agreements. Often companies don't even bother with what these concessions that we've negotiated. They're really caring about foreign direct investment issues or IP issues, I think. Okay. So what will be happen if we dump one or more preferential trade agreements? Is it the Wild West? And I have a picture of Smoot and Hawley. Is it we're going to return to the world of just really hard to our mind to wrap around 50% tariffs? And I say no. Again, naively here, I say no because there are many other existing agreements out there that, in fact, should bind us. I'm under the impression that, in fact, not all of these agreements would collapse over a sequence of terminations. We've had a lot of agreements, and I think if we don't walk away from the WTO, there's a lot of language in the WTO and all their pre-existing GATT agreements that tie our hands. So I've woken up a lot of mornings, don't understand when they talk about 35% tariff. Where would the 35% tariff come from? It might be the average Hawley Smoot tariff over a set of products, et cetera. There may be some justification for it. I have no idea. But I do know that we're going to have to either bail on the WTO if we want to impose that. Okay. Just in a couple minutes, let me just talk, I think, was an important issue about renegotiating preferential trade agreements. On the left side of the screen here, I have the idea that was kind of a TPP, or has, when we did the Central American Agreement. We have the United States, and then we have a whole bunch of other countries labeled A, B, C, D, so forth, that we might negotiate with. And we're going to bundle them all together and say, okay, this is how we do it here in the United States. Come on board, or you just don't bother, right? We kind of, it's our way or highway, and bundle them together. On the right side, I have what appears to be the new administration's view, which is that's really not better. I should go with A. It's got to deal with A, then go to B, then go to C, then go, et cetera, move down the list sequentially. It seems that I'm trying to understand. Again, I began with the early slide. I really have no idea what they're thinking. But one idea is that this is what they're thinking, so I'm going to go with it. All right, so I just thought this was funny given the campaign that Trump really talks a lot about size, and it mattered, at least at some level in the campaign, that our size should mean that we get virtually like an ultimatum game. When you're dividing, I'm going to give you a nickel, I'm taking 95 cents. You should just be happy I gave you a nickel and not a penny. All right, and that's it. So I think they're thinking of a kind of this take it or this is how we're going to approach these countries. We're going to kind of get very, very hard. This is what we're going to give you. You should sign. So in this little chart, right, the idea was we'd go USA for country A. We might go talk to country B, and then we're going to split the pie somehow with them. Again, they're really thinking a fixed pie. We're going to give them just a little bit so they can say they got something. We're going to take the lion's share, America first. And then we'll go to country C after we've finished with B, and we'll do the same thing to them, and then maybe D, E, F, right? We're going to do a series of sequence of negotiations. One thing I think that's very problematic about this, certainly trade economists have talked about, I haven't heard anybody in Washington talk about, that sequential negotiations are potentially a real game theory strategic nightmare for trade negotiators. So country B is willing to give something to sign with the United States. I'll call it X. And in return for giving the United States X, they'll get some market access to our country. And then we finish with them, we go to country C. And country C might give Z or something to us, or some other amount to us to get to our market, again, for market access. But the problem is the agreement with C very likely is going to erode some of the value of what we gave the earlier country. All right? And so that's called backward stealing. Right, that the later agreements are going to take something away from the earlier ones. And then, so country B is so excited, I get to be first with the United States, really giddy. And then they wake up 4 years later and find out that being first actually was really a drag because they thought they're going to get a bunch, and they woke up in 2020 and figured they only got 1% because they were thinking they were going to get 5%, but the other 4% was eroded away by sequences of agreements. And so country B is not going to be happy. And so what's going to happen is our trading partners are not stupid, and they're going to understand this. And so that's going to make it harder to negotiate with earlier countries. I would think earlier countries are going to understand the sequential problem, and they're going to have to negotiate harder. This is called forward manipulation, which is they're manipulating their agreement now in anticipation of what the future deals will be cut. And that's going to complicate the sequential nature. So I don't think this is my own view is it's not going to happen overnight. Now, we do have pressure on Japan in particular. There's other military and strategic reasons that Japan may want to concede to us. But as a general statement, I think these issues matter. And I just want to say that this is not just economic theory. I think if you go back and look at a history of 1930s is a really defining moment for trade economists and trade policy people about what happened following Smoot-Hawley. The U.S.'s experience in the 1930s was that this kind of sequential nature. We did have an understanding of how this was changing trade agreements, of we were doing these reciprocal agreements over time. And so it's not just an abstract theory an economist. I think it's very realistic. And our understanding of game theory is much better now than it was in 1935. That's it. Thank you.